We are living through a test optional apocalypse, and I want to talk today about its biggest victims so far. My name is Craig Meister. I'm a college admissions expert. You can go to my website, collegemeister.com, to learn more about me and how you can work with me one-on-one throughout the college admissions process. Test optional admissions was launched in earnest in the early days of the COVID-19 shutdowns in 2020. Most American colleges at that time announced that for the 2020-2021 admission cycle, for those students starting college in fall 2021, they would be test optional, whereas before that time, colleges in the United States were primarily test required, meaning that to even be considered for first year admission at the very most selective colleges in the United States of America, most of them required students to submit a strong, let alone a score, but a strong SAT or ACT score in order to have a real shot of admission. But in 2020, these colleges decided, by and large, there were a couple of exceptions, but they basically decided that no longer were they going to require strong test scores to earn admission, and they weren't going to even require test scores at all to apply. So the pandemic shutdowns are well in the rearview mirror as of right now, when this is being filmed, which is early 2024. Yet the vast majority of the colleges that went test optional in 2020 remain test optional to this day. Some have even gone test blind or test free since that time, including Caltech and the UCs and some other private schools as well that I will not name right now. But the vast majority have remained test optional, and a handful that I really do want to mention because they deserve props are schools like MIT, Georgetown, Purdue, the Georgia State schools, the Tennessee State schools, the most selective ones. They are the handful of schools that went back to being test required. But the vast majority of schools, including all Ivy League schools, remain to this date in early 2024 test optional. So that means that you can apply and get into Dartmouth or Penn or Princeton or Harvard with hopefully strong grades, good letters of recommendation, and a nice application, and you can get in. You do not need one objective measure of academic merit in order to get in to those Ivy League schools and other very selective schools like Duke and Stanford, Johns Hopkins, what have you. So why am I bringing this up? You may say, well, first of all, Craig, what are you saying? That's so ridiculous. Grades are an objective measure of academic merit. Well, if the teacher is actually grading hard, but the vast majority of not only high school teachers, but also college professors no longer feel comfortable giving students C's, and in many cases, even B's. And therefore, the vast majority of American students are getting A's in high school and certainly in college, and particularly in Ivy League colleges where they dole out A's like they're candy. So, in fact, how can you really separate all these applicants from all these diverse schools around the world who are getting very strong grades? You can't. So it would be nice to have an objective measure on a scale of, let's say, 1,600 points or 36 points, like the SAT and ACT are scored, to determine with one objective measure how all applicants compare to one another. It would be nice to have that if you cared about actually having an objectively strong, merit-centered entering class to your undergraduate institution. But American colleges don't care so much about that anymore. They care about other institutional priorities, as they like to say. So we can't change the game they play. We can only elucidate it for you. So why am I telling you this? What am I building up to? Well, today I want to talk about the greatest victims of the test optional movement. You can go to almost any other college themed or college admissions themed publication or YouTube channel or TikTok channel or what have you about to learn about the great blessings of test optional and how awesome it is and how wonderful it is and how it's really the best thing since sliced bread. But you've arrived at a video today to talk about the actual horrors of test optional, and I'm here to tell you about its greatest victim to date. However, there are many more victims of test optional that I cannot fit into this video. I could probably do a whole series of videos about the many victims of the test optional admissions movement and implementation and regime. But today I want to talk about its greatest victim. So who am I talking about? Who are the greatest victims of test optional to date? Well, let me tell you. If you were applying to a hypothetical, let's say very selective institution, let's call it University of Transylvania, okay? Tran. All right, let's talk about Tran. And at Tran, before the COVID-19 pandemic shutdowns in 2020, they required standardized test scores, and not just standardized test scores to be considered, but strong standardized test scores from the vast majority of their applicants in order to be admitted. They also required strong grades and rigorous courses, a great resume, wonderful letters of recommendations, beautifully written essays, maybe even an interview that was evaluative. So it was a multi-stage process to get into Tran, or University of Transylvania, this hypothetical school I've made up for the purposes of this particular video. And it's this particular school, University of Transylvania, Tran, their average SAT scores for admitted students, and you could look up the equivalent on the ACT, but let's focus on SAT today. The average scores for accepted students, accepted first year, formerly known as freshman students at the University of Transylvania, before the COVID-19 shutdowns, the average middle 50% of those accepted were 1410 to 1510 on the SAT. That means 25% of those students accepted as first-year students to Tran were students who scored below 1410 on the SAT. And 25% of accepted students to Tran were students who scored better than 1510 on the SAT. So the middle 50th percentile, from the 25th percentile all the way up to the 75th percentile, was 1410 to 1510. All right, but then test optional takes over. And Tran is, of course, one of the schools that goes test optional. And they have not, let's say, we're pretending here, but this pretend institution has not gone back to being test required. And over the passing four admission cycles, seeing the growth in number of applicants, because students who never would have applied without blushing before, now they're applying because they think they have a chance, and their counselors tell them they have a chance, their parents think maybe they have a chance, that are getting 1190s on the SAT, 1210s on the SAT, 1360s on the SAT, 1430s on the SAT. All these students are now applying test optionally to Tran, to University of Transylvania, this hypothetical school I've created for you for this little scenario or case study, if you will. So all of those, a kid with an 890 could be applying. Maybe he has straight A's in a school that just hands out A's like candy, and he just can't take a test because he really hasn't retained any information over the course of his K through 12 education. And he gets an 810 on the SAT, but he even is applying to University of Transylvania test optionally because he has straight A's. It looks pretty good, right? And he may have a chance now of getting into University of Transylvania. Maybe the first year University of Transylvania accepted, let's say 10, 15%, maybe even 20, 25% of students under this new regime test optionally, where the other 75% were accepted with this test scores. But then the next year, seeing that the average test scores for University of Transylvania went up since it went test optional, because now only the strongest students are submitting their test scores. And now the middle 50th percentile at University of Transylvania after 1 year of test optional admissions, let's say, is now 1430 to 1530. Well, now the kids who are getting 1410, 1400, 1420 are now more concerned about submitting their SAT scores, so they're not going to submit their SAT scores anymore. They're going to now apply test optionally. So the larger number of test optional applicants happens each year. So now we're 4 years down the line, and more students with every passing year are applying to these colleges test optionally if they're falling in what used to be the lower half, let's say, of the middle 50th percentile of what was acceptable at that University of Transylvania before test optional regime was put into place. So now in 2024, let's say after the first half of the admission cycle, ED acceptances at this school, let's pretend that they were the middle 50th percentile of accepted students now is 1,500 to 1,590 of those who submit their scores. Every student earning in the 1400s, which is a great SAT score, by the way, they're all scared as hell now to submit their SAT score to University of Transylvania because the middle 50th percentile now is purely in the 1500s. Only the best of the best of the best are now submitting SAT scores or ACT scores with the equivalent. And as a result, a student who used to be, let's say 1410 through 1490, even in that example, 1500, in the middle 50th percentile of what was acceptable at University of Transylvania, well, no longer are they in the middle 50th percent if they submit their scores. So they're all going to submit test optionally. They're all going to submit their applications without their test scores. So the biggest victims of test optional are those students who used to be in the middle 50th percentile for a particular selective college or university. And because of the way test optional has evolved, only the strongest students are now submitting their test scores, and kids with 1490s are now hiding their test scores, and they're being judged in a very similar way to how a student with a 910 on the SAT is being judged if he has the same grades. There are students today at Ivy League schools who got in test optionally who probably scored 1010 on the SAT. It used to maybe be 1, maybe 2, a child of a billionaire, 1 or 2, a child of a South American princess or something. So some very exceptional cases of an athlete, also an athlete who is going to go on to be the next Michael Jordan or the next major star in a sport. But now lots of these Ivy League schools are accepting 25% or more students test optionally. Maybe some equivalent schools, some very selective schools, are accepting 50% of their first year classes test optionally. There are some relatively selective schools in this country that are accepting over 50% of their applicants test optionally. The colleges may have the same name today that they had in 2019, 2020. They are not the same undergraduate institutions because the students who populate them, the students who live there, the students who go to class there are not the same types of students. The fact of the matter is, today at Harvard, today at Penn, and at my hypothetical University of Transylvania, there are students living in dorms, interacting with Ivy League professors who got a 1230 on their SAT and chose not to submit the score, and who have grades that were comparable to those students who had a 1490 on the SAT, but who were rejected from Penn. Now, again, there's of course a lot of other factors at play, but many of them are extremely subjective, and unfortunately, a number of them are immutable characteristics that students have no control over at all, like their zip code, like their country of origin. So things like that are now being judged very highly. As I've said multiple times now, and I will say it again, because I think it really brings into focus what we're talking about here. Caltech is now test blind, test free. That means at a school like Caltech, with this august reputation, you can apply to Caltech and write your Caltech essays about your sexual proclivities, and that will be considered in the admissions process. However, if you got a 1600 on the SAT, that will not be considered in the admissions process at Caltech. All right, so that's a test blind institution. So that's the most extreme case. The Ivies, again, are all test optional as of this filming. So why am I telling you this? The greatest victims of the test optional movement have been extremely smart, hardworking, striving students who actually are well accomplished in the academic realm and extracurricular realm, but they're being trumped and they're being shivved out of the way in terms of getting into what were known as America's most prestigious and august institutions as a result of many students who have SAT scores quite a bit lower. Now, you may not be a big fan, and I am not a big fan of the SAT or the ACT as indicative of your future success or lack of success in this world. However, it was those two tests were the only standardized measure left in the college admissions process. Everything else is not standardized, and as a result can be extremely easily fudged relative to the SAT or ACT. A billionaire's son would complain about having to sit for the SAT or ACT, whereas they could just farm out the writing of the essay to a consultant, an unscrupulous consultant, of course. They could farm out the teacher recommendation to a teacher. Not to say teachers are bribable, but schools put pressure on teachers. Lots of things can happen, and they airbrush the real reality of the student. The extracurricular activities, are very hard to pin down. It's very hard to vet every extracurricular activity. So my point being, all of the parts of the college admissions process are far more fakeable than the SAT or ACT. Now, yeah, of course, if you're truly a amoral person with a lot of money, you can pay someone to take the test and theoretically fudge or fake the ID to go into the test. But that's really getting to criminality point here. That's harder to do. The SAT and the ACT were the hardest things to fake, and they remain the hardest things to fake. And this is why I previously made a video about test optional's greatest beneficiaries. And you can actually watch that video below this video, where I talk about the top 3 types of individuals who benefit most from test optional admission. But today, again, I've talked about the greatest victims of the test optional apocalypse. And these victims are extremely impressive, though less impressive than the most impressive applicants in terms of objective scoring on the SAT and ACT. But they are completely getting screwed. They are completely getting screwed now at the most selective schools, because the most selective schools are picking students based off of, similar to how the Studio 54 used to pick people behind the rope to let them in the 1970s, based off of their looks, based off of their, what they're wearing, based off of very superficial, very things that are not academic. Let's just put it that way in many cases. All right. So again, it doesn't mean that some of these students getting a test optionally are extremely strong. And some of the people getting in still are students with a 1490 who chose not to submit their score. But a lot of students are getting in over 1440, 1450, 1470 kids. And they're coming in with 1312s or 1310s, excuse me, the 1020s, 1290s, God forbid 960s, but they have everything else perfectly curated in their application to attract the admissions officers at those schools. Now, the admissions officers at that school would say, well, that's ridiculous, Craig. No one can have straight A's and have a 1010 on their SAT. No, I've seen it so many times. Trust me, I've seen it. I've worked on the high school side. I've worked with students and families for 18 years. I've seen it. It happens all the time for a lot of reasons. Not all nefarious reasons. A lot of times it's just maybe the school's really easy or gives A's like candy, like I said. No one intentionally tried to hurt anyone. But the fact of the matter is, that's the world we live in today. So what I said in the beginning of the video is that so far, the greatest and biggest victims of the test optional movement have been basically the students who are now pushed out of the middle 50th percentile of standardized test scores, accepted students at that school, because so few students are now submitting test scores to these schools. But in the future, the greatest victims, the list will grow. Let's face it, the colleges themselves are already reaping the whirlwind of being test optional. The reputations have gone down over the last 4 years, and they will continue to go down. Many people will say, well, it's for many other reasons, Craig. It's political reasons. It's because the misstatement by the president of this university or that university. It's because of a bad actor in the junior class who did something really vile and it was on the front page in the New York Times. But all of that goes back to, who do these colleges accept these days? Who is being accepted at America's most selective colleges and universities? And what are the criteria, because they're multiple, used in order to determine whether or not a student should be accepted or rejected? It has become much more subjective since the removal of the required SAT or ACT. So I'd like to close this video by simply saying that it's not just even going to be the colleges that are victims. American society in particular will be victimized at large. in many different ways, small and large. You may in the future have a student who is operating on you. He was a student at one time, and he got into really prestigious schools. And so you think he's really smart and he's really careful, but maybe he's not, because he got into those schools test optionally. Or maybe there's an air traffic controller who got in to air traffic controlling because the record that the air traffic control applicant presented was really impressive. That could be a problem if they're really not up to it intellectually up here. That's a muscle. So just like you wouldn't want really weak baseball players or basketball players or hockey players, you don't want weak minds in positions of power in society that require strong minds, very strong minds. And colleges, for a time in our history, purported to be places where the strongest minds were. Now, that wasn't always the case either. Let me be very clear. Early in America's history, they were social clubs for certain select groups of individuals based off of immutable characteristics, or who knew, or one's wealth, or some socioeconomic class. And then for a period of time in the 1900s, there was a period of time, that's when the SAT was introduced really in earnest, and the ACT, these tests took off. The argument was, we want to accept diverse individuals based off of merit. We don't want to be a country club. We want to open our doors to a diverse group of people. How ironic. The SAT was used to level the playing field so that a very smart guy or girl, obviously guys at first because girls weren't going to college much in the early 1900s, but once the 1900s really gained steam, girls and guys who could score really well in these standardized tests but maybe came from less well-known schools or school districts or states or countries, they could be spotted and identified as top talent, even if their schools had never sent someone to a very prestigious institution before. So the SAT and ACT were actually used to broaden and diversify those who could get into the hallowed halls of America's quote-unquote top or most prestigious or august intellectual institutions. And during the beginning of the COVID-19 shutdowns, the SAT and ACT were treated as barriers to admission, and they have not been brought back. And now, like before, colleges and universities in the United States are basing their admissions decisions off of many things other than academic strength or the strength of your brain or the work ethic and such you've demonstrated in high school, and how that has played out on a test, outputting on a standardized test after you've worked hard and studied hard over 4 years. The more things change, the more things stay the same, right? So things have come full circle. And so I would plead to the higher education institutions in the United States who market themselves as highly selective. If you want to be known as strong academic intellectual institutions, I think you need to have an academic objective measure in order to get in. I think you should reinstitute the SAT or ACT as a requirement in order to be considered for admission. So therefore you need to report out the average SAT scores or ACT scores for all applicants and not just those who chose to submit their scores. It's going to help you as institutions over the long term. It's also going to help our society over the long term to have institutions of higher learning be truly institutions of higher learning and not institutions masquerading as institutions of higher learning, but who are actually accepting students based off of things very, very different from their academic chops. Yeah. So what does this mean for you? Let's say you are a student who has now been pushed out of the middle 50th percentile for a school. There are still ways to try to worm your way around it, and everything else has to be that much stronger. And so when I work with students, I really encourage them to run the table on strength across their application so that by the time they apply, as many things are going in the right direction as possible, so that if they do get pushed out of the middle 50th percentile of a current school that they really want to get into, SAT or ACT profile of those accepted students, that hopefully everything else will be just perfect or as close to perfect as possible so that they'll still have a fighting chance of admission, and maybe they'll get in test optionally. They'll be one of the most impressive students to get in test optionally. And there are ways, of course, we can still do that because other things are still being considered, like grades and letters of recommendation and extracurricular resumes in many schools, and also, of course, essays. And how to write those essays for different schools is different depending on the school. So that's why people choose to work with me, because I can coach them through the process as a college admissions expert and coach about how to make this process work best for you, and still so that you get at the end of the process, out of the process, what you want to get out of the process, i.e. getting into the 1 or 2 or 3 schools at the top of your list. But overall, I think it's a sad story. I think it's very sad that academic institutions have been turned into social engineering institutions, where favorites are picked based off of things other than what's going on up here and how strong it is. There is basketball courts for strong basketball players. There are baseball fields for strong baseball players. There are hockey ices and arenas for strong ice hockey players, football stadiums for football players. We only want the best in those places. Why don't we want the best at quote unquote the best colleges and universities in the United States anymore? Because all the other countries that have national exams, they're all there still. None of the other countries have gotten rid of their national exams that are sort of the equivalent of the ACT or SAT. Only the United States has thrown its hands up and said, there's no way we can objectively judge X student versus Y student. That's very odd. That's not true, of course. And so it's very sad. To me, it's very sad. And I would liken it, frankly, to the legalization of cannabis in the United States. Oh, it sounds like a great idea to some. And then you're walking on a street in New York City and you can't escape the smell of drugs, pot. You can't drive on a highway and have the air conditioner on without smelling weed. So that was a real big mistake. And there's more car accidents, more psychosis than ever before, more mental illness in the United States. And you bet that it can be traced back to the legalization of the stupid drug. Well, SAT and ACT optional admissions has been the normalization or the legalization of students who are less impressive academically. But do not be stressed. I exist not to stress. Therefore, if you're interested in learning how you can still reach your potential in the college admissions process, even if your SAT or ACT scores are no longer going to be benefiting you as much as they could have or should have in a world in which SAT and ACT scores were looked at as a requirement, you should absolutely go to my website, collegemeister.com, to learn more about how you can work with me one-on-one. Until next time, my name is Craig Meister. collegemeister.com is my website. And I want you to stay safe and stay well and stay stress-free as you navigate the college admissions process in the United States.